Is that what you expected him to look like?
No, I don't want to meet him anymore.
It's like going back to Montana.
There is a time. I do have one picture of him smiling, and you're going to be surprised.
Is it like
I'll get to it, but it's a surprising time you would expect to smile.
Only smile to me.
He's never. Well, I'll talk about it. Okay. If I might draw your attention to this happy fellow. Question.
I have a philosophy joke.
Wait until we get into a lull. Save it. Is it related to our topic today?
No, I wish.
Okay, it's fine. But dude, like 30 minutes in, when we're exhausted from dealing with a spiteful man,
It's basically not about philosophy.
it's totally fine. All right. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to get right into this. Many of you have heard of Dostoyevsky before. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoyevsky, born 1821, did not call himself an existentialist. Why do you think he didn't call himself that?
Does that have a negative connotation?
It's a kind of a trick question, I'm sorry. It doesn't have a well, it does to some, the negative connotation. What was that? Oh. There was no, the term hadn't been coined yet. So we go back, we do this in history of philosophy, we do this in all disciplines. We try to categorize people, we try to put them into groups so that we can better understand where they're coming from. We know what they're thinking, and that kind of categorization helps us. As we're going to see with existentialist thinking, however, that kind of logical pigeonholing is also potentially detrimental. And in fact, I just discussed this in my inductive logic class. We tend to want that, especially with politics. We want to have a sense of who we're talking to or listening to so that we can put them into a box and better understand where they're coming from, and for our own benefit, know how we should feel about what they're saying. And this happened to me not very long ago. I was watching a cable news program. It doesn't matter which show it was. And I couldn't tell whether or not I liked what this person was saying. And I realized why that was. Because I could not tell what political side of the spectrum they were on. And I was annoyed. I wanted to know. I wanted to know so that I could say, I agree, or I hate this guy. I mean, not explicitly like that, but there's a sense in which having that kind of categorization, being able to tell, here's what this person is, we now then are able better to feel good about ourselves in agreeing or disagreeing with them. And so there's a desire to compartmentalize, and in this case with Dostoevsky, to call him an existentialist. And I don't know that he would be terribly put off by that title, as we're going to see, Camus was. He did not want to be called an existentialist, Camus.
I just had a quick question. Would you realizing that is why you're wanting to know what political party that person was going with, would that be a second order desire? You know about
In Frankfurt's sense, Harry Frankfurt? I don't know. No, it's more just a confirmation bias type of thing, which is trying to push, it's just more comfortable. Knowing where someone's coming from, there's a kind of ambiguity. We tend to not like ambiguity. We tend to like psychologically, even if we say to ourselves, most of the interesting philosophical work around the world, about humanity, deals in the black and white, it deals in the gray area, so to speak, the vagueness, the ambiguity, the lived existence, the lived experiences. We tend to rather have things logical, either or. Even when we say to ourselves, no, this is interesting, we need to look at this, we tend to fall prey to that. And that was just an example of my awareness. So I can at least say that. I was aware of that, pushing that. Whether or not it's changed my perspective on it, I don't know. So, Dostoyevsky, not at the time called an existentialist. He's writing around the same time as Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, who is pushing a similar kind of worldview. I don't know to what extent either one of them were aware of each other's work. We'll see that Friedrich Nietzsche was aware of Dostoyevsky's work, and so we'll see how influenced he was by it. But the motifs that we're going to see in particular are a kind of extreme emphasis on subjectivity, of individuality. And as always, in fact, one of your questions on the study guide is this question of freedom. An extreme version of freedom, very robust sense of freedom, maybe to an absurd degree, at least with Dostoyevsky's conception of it in the reading you had for today. You know of him, I'm sure, from literature classes. You may have read, some of you have read Dostoyevsky before, maybe Crime and Punishment, maybe The Brothers Karamazov, maybe any other number of his novels, which every one of them is at least this thick, because I believe that's a requirement of Russian novelists. I'm not sure. He's a literary figure. The method he uses, I've got to go, I don't have the clicker, somebody took the batteries out, so I've got to go this archaic way of pushing a button. Oh, sorry, yes.
They're paid by word, the Russian.
Oh, right.
They're
So
paid by word.
so they're not obligated to, but Dostoevsky would send out serially some of his works, and he would get paid as he goes, so that he could eventually get an entire text that turns out to be extremely expensive. I don't know that that's the best way of... It's not, let me just say. Especially if philosophy, you got paid by the word for publishing. Oh, can you imagine the shit that you'd be reading after that? Yeah, sorry, shouldn't use those words. Maybe it's best that you don't get paid for publishing nowadays. So anyway, what kind of approach is he using? He's going to use a similar approach to Kierkegaard and to Sartre and Camus. Sartre will look at, we're actually looking at two of his philosophical works as opposed to his literary works. I'll talk about Sartre's Nausea. I'll talk about his play No Exit as it relates to these existentialist themes. But the two central philosophical works from Sartre, Existentialism as Humanism and Being and Nothingness, are what we'll be looking at from him. But it's not insignificant, the medium that existentialists employ. This idea of the novel. I like Milan Kundera. Anyone heard of Milan Kundera, the novelist? Czech novelist. Unbearable Lightness of Being. They made a movie about that. Fantastic movie and book about a lot of existentialist ideas going back to Friedrich Nietzsche. In any case, Kundera tells us the novelist is neither historian nor prophet. He is an explorer of existence. Neither historian nor prophet. And I like the way that sounds, because the historian's looking backward at the past. The prophet is, in a way, looking forward into the future. Right? You look at certain existentialists who are past-looking, who look back. You look at Sartre, who's mostly looking forward. The self is a projection, literally, into that which is not. The future hasn't happened yet. It is a nothingness. And then you have Camus. And here's a division between Camus and Sartre. They were friends for a long time. They have very similar backgrounds, as did Simone de Beauvoir, in both responding to the times in which they lived, to the oppression, the tyranny, and the World War I and II. Although Camus was born into lower middle class society, in contrast to Sartre and Beauvoir. But Camus is interested in the present, as we're going to see, and it seems that Dostoevsky might be as well. And as we'll see, the key focus on these kinds of existentialist literature, the novel, the short story, the play, what is different about this approach to philosophy? And what is significant? What is perhaps superior, let's say, from what we looked at before with analytic philosophy?
Is it a little more subjective?
Yes? How so?
Well, for example, like in our reading, the novelist, or not the novelist, the person, the perspective is him going through life and examining how he feels about certain things, and his examination of how he feels about the way he's thinking.
And in an argument, you can take on a different side of an argument. You can imagine, presuming, the perspective of the person putting forth the arguments. Here are the reasons. I lay them out, premise, conclusion, format, and I take you to the conclusion. But with a story that has the kind of subjectivity, the lived experience of the individual, you get it, as you say, you get it from a kind of, I don't want to say, well, it is unique, and it's malleable. It's, think of terms of plays. So we'll look at Sartre, we'll look at Camus. Camus wrote plays as well. And you look at Dostoyevsky's kind of autobiographical, to an extent, confessional, which is an odd notion. This is kind of what we're reading here, is a kind of confession. That is a different way of approaching philosophical ideas. It's giving the ideas, it's giving examples, as opposed to arguments. It's taking you to a position, either assuming that you're already on board with some of the ideas, they're taken for granted, but they're showing you things rather than arguing for them. They're revealing something in a way that straightforward argument doesn't seem typically capable. You find it very difficult to make philosophical arguments for existentialist themes, although we're going to do that with Sartre next week. It's very difficult to put things into standard logical form. When you're talking about the individual experiences of subjectivity and freedom and in particular choice, which takes me back to the Sartre thing that I didn't finish, existentialism as a humanism. And the example that he gives, page 13 and 14, of the choice. And you see a bit of this too, with the anguish that comes from having this freedom and potentially the use of freedom, or the use of one's acts to demonstrate freedom. We'll see with Dostoyevsky. But just to backtrack a little bit, what is Sartre's point about that conundrum that person's in with respect to staying and helping his ailing mother versus going off to fight for the country? What is Sartre's point? Yeah.
The meaning or the right choice is ultimately the choice that you decide to make. There is no inherent right or wrong choice. Each choice can be justified, and whatever you choose is kind of like they both have their properties that are going to make a certain difference. You know, whether you're making a difference in your mother's world or you're making a difference in the country. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just what you choose is.
There's no right or wrong answer. So, well, is that what he wants to say? It sounds like that. I think that's right. In this, there's enough there perhaps to lead to that conclusion. When we look at his description of bad faith in being in nothingness, he'll have a different response that says, well, you can be mistaken. You can be inconsistent. You can fall prey to bad faith. You can engage in self-deception. So Sartre does want to be able to be judgmental. After all, at one point, I should have told you to read the whole thing, but I didn't require it. But at one point, he does reserve the word scum to people who are inconsistent. Where does he talk about that? Yeah, page 30 of this. This is from Sartre, Existentialism and Humanism. Others who try to show that their existence is necessary when it is merely an accident, or what he'll call contingent, an accident of the appearance of the human race on earth, I shall call scum. But neither cowards nor scum can be identified except on a plane of strict authenticity. So he does have some degree of moral grounding, but it's not absolute, it's not obvious what that is. It does leave it open as to, well, at least I'm being consistent and authentic. Well, you could be consistently and authentically a horrible person. And does Sartre have a way of critiquing that? It's not clear what a priori argument he could possibly give to show that what you're doing is wrong. And so there you're right. He doesn't seem to have an argument against somebody's behavior as long as it was done, whatever this means, authentically. By the way, wasn't there a politician who recently used the word scum to refer to his political opponents? I don't know who that was. Who was that? Don't need to answer it. But it wasn't his political opponents. It was people in his own party who just disagree with him. And the response to them, they are scum. That word has a history to it, believe it or not. That's a tough word. And I'm surprised Sartre actually used it. Let's see, he's using this from 1946. Yes. I'm sure he was aware of the Nazi propaganda machine using terms like that to refer to Jews. So it is odd that he uses that term there. It seems a bit incongruous. Anyway, here is the choice that Sartre references. I will refer to the case of a student of mine who sought me out in following circumstances. His father was quarreling with his mother and was also inclined to being a collaborator. His elder brother had been killed in the German offensive, and this young man, with a sentiment somewhat primitive but generous, burned to avenge him. His mother was living alone with him, deeply afflicted by the semi-treason of his father and by the death of her eldest son, and her one consolation was this young man. And he knows all this. And Sartre says this young man still has a choice. Go fight. Is that texting or note-taking? Note-taking or texting?
What's that again?
Oh, okay. I can't tell. All right. So you have a choice to text in class. You should not do it. I'll take your word that you were note-taking. Anyway, notice he goes to Sartre for advice. What does Sartre say about that? He goes to this guy for advice. Go ahead.
Yeah, so he goes to Sartre for advice, and Sartre says that, you already knew, basically. It's predetermined. You knew all these people you could ask for advice.
Well, not predetermined, but he doesn't want to use that word.
Anticipated or something.
You've already made a choice.
Yeah, because you knew if you went to the priest, he'd give you this kind of answer. And if you went to your best friend who drinks all the time, he'd give you this kind of answer.
That's right.
And you go to me, the free will guy, and I'm going to tell you, follow your free will, right? You knew this was what I was going to say.
You already, yes. And so we still, when we choose who our moral exemplar is, when we choose who to follow, when we choose to seek out advice from somebody else, that's not taking away our responsibility. If we realize we chose them because we wanted the answer that they were going to give. People do this. My father-in-law he hates doctors, first of all, but he will go to different doctors and find the one that gives him the advice that he wants to hear. He's already made his mind up, but he now wants to seek it out by those who will just reinforce what he already wants to be the case. And so even in seeking, even in not choosing and doing nothing, of course, Sartre will tell us that is to have made a choice. You are, in a sense, condemned to make a choice. You are condemned to be free. And so we're stuck, and there's no, as he says on 14, there are no a priori arguments, moral or otherwise, to establish what the right thing to do is. In every case, the individual is still making an individual choice. This individual and its concrete existence, that is the primary focus for existentialists, and in particular Sartre, and we'll see with Dostoyevsky in a moment. Yes?
The thing I found really weird about that passage when I read it was that, in a way, even though Sartre's the free will guy, it almost feels like it's denying agency to the people you're asking advice from. Because wouldn't you think that you could go to a priest and you could say, hey, I need advice, and the priest's advice would be, keep on sinning. Sinning's great because that's a free choice that he could make as an entity, right? Or you could go to Sartre and you could say, hey, I want your advice, and Sartre could say, actually, I don't think you should be free. I think you should be a slave, right? Like, if you say that a person you go to advice to is going to be consistent, always consistent and predictable, aren't you kind of denying them agency?
Sartre would not say it that way, and your conception of consistency, of course, is one that speaks of their character, and character is one thing that we hope to be consistent, but that doesn't. Consistency of character and authenticity of character does not imply a lack of freedom. Why would it be the case that since I can expect, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to get this particular advice from you if I come to speak to you? Why would that act of me choosing to get advice from you limit your freedom? Is that what you're saying it would do? Because I expect... No, it would not think it limits freedom.
If I'm saying that I can predict what you're going to do before you do it, in a way, isn't that denying your essential freedom?
I see. No, because your prediction is not based on any kind of absolutes. You can make inferences based upon your character and your choices in the past. I infer that you will probably be consistent and act in this way. But people are, as we know with Dostoyevsky and we'll see with Camus, people are complex. People do things that you would not expect. Sometimes they even do things that are disadvantageous to them, to themselves. Sometimes they vote in ways that are not in their best interest. They do it anyway. We are predictably irrational, to use language of contemporary psychology and economics. Dan Ariely, in his book Predictably Irrational, is an attempt, it's a recent book, It's an attempt at bursting that bubble of this presumption that we can predict human behaviors based on their rationality. Humans are rational, but as Dostoyevsky is going to point out, that's a tiny fraction of us. And if that's what we are, going back to Aristotle, the rational featherless biped, that's what we are defined as. We have 2 feet, and we don't have feathers, so we're different than these stupid birds, which are actually quite clever. So probably should change the conception of this. And we're rational. Well, I mean, we're more than rational. If that's all that we are, you start to see some of the problems raised by Dostoyevsky in his text, Notes from Underground, or Notes from Under the Floorboard, or something like that, different translations. And if you look to Walter Kaufmann, who is, I think, one of the best sources of understanding existentialism, he's pretty clear about this. This is one of the most revolutionary and original works of world literature, and the best overture to existentialism ever written. So, having read that, surely this is where you should start. We only had a small section of it, but I wonder if when you read that you thought, yes, this is revolutionary. And also, and we'll see, I think, do I have Nietzsche? Yes. Nietzsche will say, and I'll get you a question in 1 second, I did not even know of the name Dostoyevsky just a few weeks ago. An accidental reach of the arm in a bookstore, this seems unlikely, but whatever, brought to my attention Notes from Underground. The instinct of my kinship, or how should I name it, spoke up immediately. My joy, my Freude, was extraordinary. Did you sense joy? Did you feel joy as you read the selection from Dostoyevsky today? Was that the first feeling you had? Maybe.
Not the
Yeah.
first.
Did you have a little amusement? Was it funny?
I was so impressed because it felt relatable.
It was really. Oh. Hold on that thought. I mean, you had a question, and I'm
My
going to get you a
question
thought.
is is it really this big? The book?
Oh, no, sorry.
How big is this one? Is this readable?
Yeah.
I'm not very good at reading. If it's that, I can do that.
Well, it's not this. What is it? I don't know.
You can just
130
do
pages? Well, there's a couple of texts in this thing. It's not that long. Sorry, it's not really.
It's 140 pages.
This one's about 140. Yeah. Oh,
Whoa.
wow. You don't even have the book. I've got it right in my hands. You're going to find it quicker. Who needs books? Let's just burn this shit. No, let's not do that now. We don't need to do that. Bad idea. So it's not that long. But we had a small section of it, which I think encapsulates the basic gist. I think I gave you the opening lines. I am a sick man. There's some cut there. I am a spiteful man. An unattractive man. I think my liver hurts. That's one of my favorite openings of any text. I'm not sure, but I think. And then there's this spleen is affected at some points. But actually, I don't know a damn thing about my illness. I'm not even sure what it is that hurts. I am not in treatment and never have been, although I respect both medicine and doctors. Besides, I am superstitious in the extreme. Well, at least to the extent of respecting medicine. Now we don't understand what the hell he's saying. I'm sufficiently educated not to be superstitious, but nevertheless I am. No, sir, I refuse to see a doctor simply out of spite. Against whom? The profession? Humanity? Himself? He seems sort of self-loathing, perhaps. Now that is something that you probably will fail to understand. Well, I understand it. Okay. Naturally, I will not be able to explain to you precisely whom I will injure in this instance by my spite. I know perfectly well that I'm certainly not giving the doctors a dirty deal by not seeking treatment. I know better than anyone that I will only harm myself by this, and no one else. And yet, if I don't seek a cure, it is out of spite. My liver hurts? Good. Let it hurt still more. What's wrong with this fellow? And what is the joy that Nietzsche feels? Wait till we see a little bit more of Nietzsche to get a better sense of this. You were going to say. I cut you off.
I just found it relatable, and then you cut me off where I was done. So it's.
Sorry.
That
So I
was
didn't
it.
cut you off. If you were done, then I didn't cut you off
Technically, no.
at the very end. So it's relatable. To what extent is it relatable? Well, let's start with this. Who wants to offer the worst thoughts you've ever had? Who wants to share them? This will be cathartic. Doesn't need to leave this room. Although I am going to add it to this slide and share it with others. Go ahead.
The meaninglessness of our individual existence.
So is that a terrible thought? I guess it could be. Say it again. I didn't hear it all.
The meaninglessness of our individual existence.
The meaninglessness of our individual existence. That implies that perhaps there's, however, meaningfulness with respect to our collective lives. Is that implied in that?
It is implied.
Ah, okay. So that's not terrible. All right. There's something there, but it feels good to get that out. Isn't that what we do with if you get therapy? You get things out. You pull the fly out of the bottle, to borrow from the therapeutic philosopher Wittgenstein. And you go to confession, which a little bit of what the spiteful man seems to be doing. What are you doing in confession but telling somebody the worst things about yourself? All right, yes. So 1, 2, 3.
So I'll go back to when I was like 14.
Go on.
What if I kicked that 9-year-old down the stairs?
Wow, that was a very explicit memory that stayed with you.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah.
It was at a hotel.
And was this 9-year-old a especially wretched little shit that warranted this?
I feel like it's a common bad thought I have. I don't know why I feel ill will towards children, but
Because they're the worst. It's pretty
There you go.
easy
And
to answer
there's
that.
an age range there. If they're under 8, it's kind of messed up. But if it's like 8 to 12,
Where they
or so,
should know better. Yeah,
where-
yeah. That's the age of reason and the age of culpability for Dostoyevsky and Eastern Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy. Age of 8 and above. That'll be relevant when we look at his philosophy of religion in the Grand Inquisitor. So yeah, that's a relatively
Like, if
spiteful.
I caused some sort of physical oomph, would they stop? Something like that.
Yeah, interesting.
It's not like you would ever do.
No, it's just a thought.
And that's interesting too. Now the spiteful man, this is he talks about things that he has done and how he's annoyed other people. He has affected other people. So he's confessing to this audience, which is us, about these horrible things that he's thought. And that's an interesting question. Does it make us bad people if we have bad thoughts? And I'm not, again, assuming that those are, I'm not putting a moral assessment to that at all yet. Yes, and then, yeah.
Are you a mandated reporter?
Yes.
Then I'm not gonna.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, it's a group. You don't have to. This was partly joking here. You don't have to. But yes, I am, by the way. And on a serious note, when we get to Camus, I mean, this is a serious note here. When we get to Camus, next class on Wednesday, and I shortened the reading because it is long, but as you'll know, the very central question is a difficult one. He opens with a really difficult question, and it has to do whether life is worth meaning. And that's a serious issue. You want to talk about practical philosophy. What does philosophy have to do with real world scenarios? Whether or not life is worth living is pretty damn practical. We just had Suicide Prevention Month in September. And so this is a real world scenario, and it's, I don't want to say epidemic, but it is an enormous problem, not just in the United States, but across the world, and we'll get into that philosophically. Yeah.
I don't know if there's one.
I'm sorry?
Your opponent?
Oh, I skipped you.
Talking about something with Mason, because if that was the case, you would just do
No,
that.
you can go.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, then I'll come back
I
to you.
was in kindergarten, and I was the line leader, so it was like designated. People got this role assigned to them,
Yeah?
and this one dude named Ryan kept assuming the role of line leader when I was the line leader, and eventually, after the third or fourth time, I got really upset. We were all in the hallway, and I screamed at him, "You're not going to come to my birthday party, or you're not invited," or something like that. And everyone got quiet, and he started crying.
Yeah.
And the first thought that came to my mind was like, wow, I'm really embarrassed right now, but I feel so good. Like, really, really good.
How old were you, said?
It was kindergarten, something like that.
Wow, but that memory stuck with you.
Oh,
Why
yeah,
do
it
these
was pretty
memories stick?
intense.
I have memories still of going through arguments in my own head. In fact, that gets me to the next thing. Well, I'll get to that.
And satisfaction.
Yeah, well, before I do, let me get to your comments.
I don't want to have kids because I don't feel comfortable bringing another human into this world with so much pain. I don't
Yeah.
know how anyone else feels about that.
Yeah, well,
That is one of the worst. I mean, it's not that I would love my own little person someday, maybe, but it would seem unethical. I don't know if that's a thought anyone else has had, but.
I want to clone myself.
it's a. All right, let me divert back to. I brought that on. It is a whole movement. In fact, a colleague of mine at Marquette, what is it? Antinatalism is the movement. Largely because, I'm looking outside to see if there are any fires, largely because of the state that we put this earth in, largely because we've got too many people. Perhaps, I don't know if there's too many people, we could probably fit them all into Texas if we had to. But there's not enough resources, or we're not distributing resources properly. And there is a question about whether or not we're obligated to future generations, which is a conundrum. It's a paradox. I don't want to get too much into it, but how can it be obligated to someone who doesn't exist? And if their existence is dependent upon us bringing them to existence, if we choose not to bring them into existence, then we no longer have obligations to them because they're never going to be brought into existence.
And that seems very existentialist. Kind of.
Yes?
About existence.
Well, it is. It is. It is about concrete existence and our responsibilities to... See, Sartre's interested, and Dostoyevsky's interested, and in particular Camus is interested in existence in the here and now. In fact, Camus will be distinguished from Sartre with respect to that, Sartre looking forward, Camus in the present. But let me wait on Camus for a moment. So what is he? I'm trying to ask who's like this. It is possible that we do have people like this, and we find it amusing, and I find it interesting that we find it amusing, and I find it interesting that we enjoy it. There's something that if you read through this, if you go back to reading Notes from Underground with the eye for a comedic, humorous approach, not in the sense of frivolously funny, but funny, and also a bit of funny, ha. And I think that there is a lot of possible fodder for humorists within existentialist ideas. And you pull out stuff from Sartre, you pull out stuff from Camus and Dostoyevsky, and you find out that, well, Woody Allen's, almost all of his career is built on making stories about and on the lines of existentialist motifs. The very last class, I hope to show, if not the whole thing, at least most of his crimes and misdemeanors, which to my mind is clearly an homage to Dostoyevsky's Crime and Punishment. And in it, it is filled with existentialist ideas. In addition, it's also funny. What is it about humor? What is it about that we find amusing about absurdity? And there's different senses of absurdity. In the analytic sense of absurdity, we'd say, for instance, we have a method of argumentation. It's called a reductio ad absurdum, which is to say, reduce the opposing viewpoint to absurdity. Reveal a contradiction and show that it's a flaw. With existentialism, it's recognizing that there are fundamental contradictions and not trying to gloss over them, not trying to ignore them, not trying to fix them or dissolve the problem, but as we'll see with Camus, live in the tension of that contradiction because it's something you cannot escape. You can rebel against it, and there are different ways of rebelling. Some are philosophical, and he finds those to be problematic. Some are theological, Camus would find those to be problematic. And others are just giving up altogether and committing suicide. There's philosophical suicide, then there's actual suicide. He advocates, by the way, against these. Camus will advocate for maintaining and fighting against this urge for suicide, for those who make the case that life is not worth living. And it's interesting that we find people like Larry David. If you don't know Larry David, he's the co-creator of Seinfeld. He's the character. He says things like this, but this is Dostoevsky's Spiteful Man. This might have come from Larry David's Curb Your Enthusiasm. Anyone seen that show? It's uncomfortable to watch. You know it's going to go terrible. You know he's a spiteful human being. He says things like this. It's funny, though, in some strange way. It's a kind of way of subverting our expectations and what we presume to be appropriate. And is this page, where is that, page 5, yes. Living past 40, it's indecent, it's immoral. Who Who lives past 40? I'll tell you, fools and scoundrels. Not me yet, but fools and scoundrels. That does sound like Larry David, where he's at a Starbucks, I'm sure. Some vanilla bullshit latte kappa thing, whatever, you don't care. You have to know more about him. In fact, one of the characters, this is where I was going to talk about my arguments that I have in my head. We oftentimes engage in these kinds of spiteful acts within our own heads. I don't know, maybe you don't, but you've thought about this. You've engaged in made-up arguments where you go through an entire dialogue in your own head about this slight that somebody has done to you, and you go through the argument. It takes energy. It takes away from you. Maybe you're even with your children as you're rehearsing this stupid argument in your head about what you could have done or what you could have said. I had this happen to me, I'll just tell you, and I've mentioned this before in the logic class when it has to do with what you should take argument to be. An argument shouldn't be a war, it shouldn't be a fight, it shouldn't be a battle, because when you see argument as a war, you treat it as something that's a zero-sum game in which you're trying to defeat your opponent. And so this is not too long ago, maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I'm at a conference presenting a paper, and somebody in the audience had a rebuttal to it, called me out for a fallacy, an error in one of my arguments. I don't even remember what the error was, because I was too angry that I didn't have a rebuttal to this person. And I went through my head. As I was leaving the conference, I didn't even listen to what the person's critique was, to thereby potentially improve my argument. I just ignored it, pissed off that I couldn't come up with a rebuttal so that I could win in the argument. And I felt like, and I laughed at myself, I recalled the story from Seinfeld. Do you remember where George Costanza, he was stuffing his face full of shrimp at the meeting, and then somebody said, "Hey, George, the ocean called. They're running out of shrimp." George actually, the first time, didn't answer, so this didn't happen until later. And he got in the cab, angry that he didn't have a rebuttal, and then he's like, I wish I'd said this. And his rebuttal at that point was, "Yeah, well, the jerk store called, they're running out of you." And that he said that one later, and that one failed. So he went with Kramer's suggestion, "Oh, well, I slept with your wife," which that didn't work either, because the guy's wife was in a coma, as it turned out. So that all failed. The point is that he's kind of rehearsing this mentally, which is a kind of spite that eats one up from the inside. And so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Why don't people respond like that in the moment?
Like what? Like immediately with the spiteful response?
No. With, obviously sometimes, I'm sure it's happened to everyone, and it would be ridiculous if it hadn't, but where you're in an argument and then you think of something later that you could have said, just like what you're talking about. What do you think clouds that person's
I don't know.
cognition in the moment?
Well, for me, it was frustration and shame that I didn't do well in the paper. And the paper was fine, and it could have been improved if I'd said, "That's an interesting critique. Maybe that is." I don't even remember what the critique was. I know it was good enough because I didn't have a rebuttal to their rebuttal. But I didn't use it to improve my argument. I ignored it, basically, and I think because of the emotional cloudiness there of my sense of individual myself having been harmed by not being able to defend my position as if I was that argument. See, that's another problem with taking argument as war. If I'm called out for a mistake, it feels like I'm wrong instead of your claim is mistaken. This is actually important with contemporary politics. When you get into a debate with somebody on the political other end of the spectrum, you say, "I think you're mistaken." What you've done is said, and what they're interpreting is, "You think to my core I'm mistaken, I'm evil, I'm wrong." No, all we're saying is your claims are mistaken, and here's why. And yet, I wasn't able to read it in that way. And I think that's largely, I don't know about Costanza. He's a spiteful man. He's much like the mouse that Dostoyevsky is talking about. But he's not alone, I think, is Dostoyevsky's point. Dostoyevsky is not saying, "And this is how we should be," right? It's a complex, it's contradictory, it's a story, it's a narrative, it's a confession. It's not a straightforward argument. Go ahead.
When you invest yourself into something, whether it's a painting or an argument or your thesis, you are putting so much effort into it that it's like a part of you becomes channeled into that. And so when other
That's
people
true.
criticize that, in a way they're criticizing you because that thing is a really meaningful expression of yourself.
That's right.
So if you say, I have this great argument, I took forever thinking about it, and you say, oh, that's wrong, let me show you how that's wrong, in a way that is
Yeah.
kind of, in a way it kind of is attacking you because that argument must have meant something to you. Right?
And that is why seeing argument as more of a collaboration is beneficial, I think, because it shows, like you present an argument and I say, well, here's where I might question you and maybe help to work and prove it, which is to show you that I'm interested in it and that I take it seriously and I think it matters enough for me to critique it. That's why I prefer you present a paper and you get comments. In fact, next week I'm going to a conference where it's the Lighthearted Philosopher Society. They have hecklers instead of commenters. And I received a heckle review of the paper, and it's in-depth, it's extensive, and it's serious. And the way I now try to look at it is, they're not shitting on me as an identity, as a person. They're taking what I've argued seriously enough to critique it and show, here's where I think it's important, here's where I think you can improve, here's where I would look, here's a potential counterexample, what do you think about this counterexample? I could read that as, how dare you attack my identity, or thank you for taking the argument seriously enough to read it all the way through and come up with an insightful commentary. But I've been doing this a long time, and I hope next week I'm able to keep that facade of, not facade. But no, I really think that's important, and I think that's a fine line, and I think we have to change our conception of what argument is. And philosophy as a discipline, analytic philosophy in particular, not continental. Continental philosophy is different in this regard. But analytic philosophy, which is support your argument, defend it, attack against rebuttals, right? It's a clear case of destroying your opponents. And that's how I was trained in analytic philosophy predominantly. And that's what you bring to the discussion. And I find that to be problematic. And especially when you take that into politics and ethics. It's not just an argument I've developed, it's my values now that you disagree with. That seems to be getting at my core. And when Sartre calls somebody scum, I still can't get past that. Clearly there he's getting at not just, you're putting forth a position here, but he's saying you are being inconsistent to your core. You're being inauthentic. But that's jumping a little bit ahead. All right, let's get through more of the Dostoyevsky so we can at least introduce Camus and his book, The Stranger, so that we won't have too much to do on Wednesday. All right. Oh, could you kick that back on for us? I want to focus on this discussion of consciousness and too much consciousness. Does too much consciousness paralyze us? What does he mean by this? Any consciousness at all, he says, is a disease. And then he says, on the other hand, so there's a kind of tension going back and forth. It's not clear at this point what he's going to be pushing for. On the other hand, the direct and active men, these are all dull and limited. What's the two poles here? What is he examining here? Go ahead.
He's examining the degree to which people think things through. So I think when he's saying consciousness can be a disease, is that if you overthink something, you can paralyze yourself in terms of your decision making, just in terms of any action you might take. It makes it a lot harder to make a decision. So
yeah.
I think he's saying that direct and active men don't have that problem because they don't think things through, and they're limited in that they have less options presented to them because they don't consider them.
And which is the better? Does he tell us? Which do you think?
Which is better?
If you had to address this dichotomy, and maybe it's a false dichotomy, surely it's a matter of degrees. There are those, as he says on page 5, those who are stupid. He is stupid, I admit. But perhaps a normal man should be stupid. How do we know? Perhaps it's even very beautiful that way, right? Is there a middle ground where I'm a little stupid, but I'm stupid enough to get things done, which is an odd way of putting it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a middle ground. Which is better, I don't really know. I think they're both, problems, overthinking and not thinking enough about
Yeah, just before I get to the hands, it reminds me, I had a student years ago at previous school who said after class, came to office hours, I don't really like philosophy. No disrespect. And I don't know what I said. Because it makes you think too much. And it's paralyzing. That's the word she used. And I sat there for a second. I remember I had a joke in my mind to say, but I thought, it's inappropriate. I just sat there, pensive, which means thoughtful. And I said, well, that may be. And can you overthink things? Can you be stuck so much in theory that in practice nothing gets done? And I can see that critique. In fact, this is a critique that Marx has against philosophers, which I can't remember if I mentioned Marx in this slide. No, it's in Camus. Marx will say something like, the point of philosophy is to change the world, not just to think about it. Just thinking about it is mental masturbation, ultimately, is what Marx will put it. That's a quote, actually. He says that phrase. And so there's something to that. Let me get the other hands now before I go back. Who else? No? Somebody else?
I agree with this dichotomy because a lot, well, I don't want to make any outright claims, but I find that a lot of people don't recognize their cognitive dissonance, or they are willfully ignorant to it and refuse, even when he writes about how he knows that he's spiteful and he knows he's these things, but he refuses to change it. And I've seen the act of stubbornness in so many lives that personally I have seen this dichotomy a little bit. I find that his takeaway that while that life of ignorance is envious, I would not want to be it.
Yeah, ignorance is that, do I have that one? Ignorance is bliss? Oh, there it is. So that's from The Matrix, if you recall. That's the guy he's in The Matrix right now eating steak. It's kind of gross to watch somebody eat over and over again. So you know what, that's enough. You've seen enough. Ignorance is bliss. He's the one that chooses to stay ignorant. But he knows. And I don't know if that's quite what's going on here. It'd be like willful ignorance, as you mentioned. And there's a clear dissonance there. There's a clear recognition of the contradiction here. In The Matrix, I don't need to ruin the film for you if you haven't seen The Matrix. That's your own damn fault. But the experience of the flavor of steak is not real, but at least I get the facade of that. And he prefers that to the real world of existence, which is difficult, which is terrible, which is, in this case, your batteries hooked up to machines, so that's kind of a little bit different here. But the hyper-conscious person, the one who's aware, I guess what Dostoyevsky is going to be talking about is the philosopher. Here he is again, somewhat stern. Again, I don't think they smiled much back then because photographs took a long time. It's not just that everyone was pissed off at the world. It's just that you wouldn't smile for literally a minute or two. That's how long it would take for I think they were called daguerreotypes. So it wasn't just everyone was angry. It was that it took a long time to take photographs, okay? I think that's why. But think about this idea that this consciousness, and this is going to be a motif within Camus as well. There's something about the lucidity, the awareness, the consciousness. That's where the absurd comes in. Dostoevsky references the absurd too. In fact, he calls it absurd, not the absurd, in the way that Camus will. He does this on page 7. Consciousness, of course, is necessary for this. I can skate through life in a way with a kind of ignorance. And there's an understanding of certain about what? I don't want to know about how I'm going to die or when I'm going to die. And in fact, we prefer the ignorance so much about our own death, as Camus is going to say, we tend not to think about it at all. In fact, he mentions in The Stranger at one point that, or maybe it's the myth of Sisyphus actually, he talks about this, that we seem to purposely pretend. We can't imagine our own deaths. And here he differs from Sartre. Sartre will talk about the imagination of our own deaths as the death of thought, whereas Camus focuses on the death of our bodies. I can't imagine what it's going to be like to no longer feel my heart beating. That's a subtle point, but it's a fundamental difference. Camus is all about physical existence, and we start to transition from, as we'll see, from Descartes into this. What this spiteful man is pushing with this conscious lucidity, as Camus puts it, and it connects, I think, with Dostoyevsky here, is an awareness and a response to a current development that was around the same time. This book, The Notes from Underground, is a response to a book called, I didn't write it down, I can never remember, Chernikov. I can't remember the name of the book, but it was basically pushing socialism. It was basically pushing utilitarianism and scientific rationalism. That's what this book by a Russian author around the same time, just prior to this book, came out. And Dostoevsky sees the ideas of socialism. He sees the ideas of hyper-rationalism. I think this idea of the Enlightenment thinking and scientific thinking. The idea that we are reducible to physical atoms or something like that. He finds that is stripping away of individual freedom. And one way of responding to the concern that he sees of where we can just make people happy by giving them things, in doing so, we remove our independence, we remove our freedom. And as he puts on page 9, what we need is only our own independent wishing, whatever that independence may cost, which is an extreme view. In fact, it seems the spiteful man is using his spite. Here he is again, frowning as always. I mean, come on. It's an extreme defense of this subjectivity. He's attacking the abstractions of science. He's attacking, in a way, the abstractions of moral systems, systematic thinking that says, here are the general rules and they apply universally. Notice our moral sense, our systematic philosophy attempts at getting at the abstract, which is to pull out from individual lived experiences. You've gotten rid of the individual in that sense. Think of it as the opposite direction of reductionism, right? Where Churchland and the reductive materialists were trying to reduce human consciousness down to the neurons. You can think of the other option of going the other direction and trying to figure out what human nature is by abstracting away from the particulars to give us an overriding umbrella. And in doing this, you take away, we'll see this with Friedrich Nietzsche as well, you take away the individual lived experiences. So science and reason, they abstract from the lived, the individual. I don't know why I mentioned the online dating app example. Is there a reason for that? Probably. I really don't remember. I'm guessing, what do they look for? I don't know. There's a reason for that. I can't remember what it was. Well, you put abstract features about yourself that are categories that people will hope for. And, they're replaceable. Actually, that relates to Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard would hate these apps, right? You're looking for these features, but these are universal features, right? And so if I find somebody who has more of those features, I'll just go to that person. The individual, in Kierkegaard's sense, is then lost. It's just these abstract features that one is seeking rather than an individual who has the features. I'll have to say more about that later because I can't actually recall. There's more. There's something more in depth about that online dating app that I can't remember exactly what it was. And then, of course, he's attacking this conception of rationality and the idea that we're rational beings and that we're always rational and that we can be defined by our rationality. In fact, where was the statement? He equates us to this overly uber-scientific way, similar to what Sartre says that we're not cauliflowers, whereas he says we're not the square root of something. What does he say? Does anyone remember that?
Yeah.
Oh, page 9. And though our life, on the second column toward the bottom, and though our life in these manifestations will often turn out a pretty sorry mess, it is still life and not a mere extraction of square roots. I don't quite know what that means. After all, I quite naturally want to live in order to fulfill my whole capacity for living, and not in order to fill my reasoning capacity alone, which is no more than some 1/20th of my capacity for living. The numbers there, I have no idea. 1/20th, that's fine. We'll give him that. But there's much more to us than just our there it is. I thought than just our reason. And by the way, here he is dead. what is significant about his face when he is dead? I'm sorry, but that is a smile, people.
Is that the one photo you meant?
Yes, that's the one photo I could find in which he is smiling. And he's dead. What is the how much should we read into that?
Did they make him smile?
I don't know that you can. That looks like a genuine, maybe it's a smirk, maybe it's a bit of scorn. I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, to wrap this up, our most advantageous advantage is our freedom. It takes him a while to get to this. He sort of teases us, right? What is this thing that is most important to us? He keeps hinting at it throughout. Where is it? Oh, there, sorry. All the way up, page 8, right? Your advantages are prosperity, wealth, freedom, peace of mind, and so on and so forth. So that a man would, for instance, openly and knowingly choose to act in opposition to this whole scheme would, in your opinion, and of course in mine too, be an obscurantist, which is Critchley's term, or a complete madman, wouldn't he? Yet there is something astonishing about this. How is it that in calculating man's advantages, all these statisticians, sages, and humanitarians invariably omit one of them? They omit this conception of freedom, right? We try to engage in statistics. What are statistics? They give you the average. They're trying to give you averages. What does the average American think? The average American doesn't exist. That is an abstraction, right, for the purposes of trying to get a conception. In fact, even Bertrand Russell points of this notion of an abstraction. And there's his death mask, although these death masks are interesting. In 1881, this conception of his death we'll talk more about when we look at his philosophy of religion section. But keep in mind this discussion of individual freedom and the use of it, and what lengths he goes to try and prove that he has freedom, even to the extent of harming himself. It's basically kicking himself in the crotch just to show, aha, you systematizing rationalists, you scientists who think we can define away human freedom, I'll show you. I'll show you by doing harm, I'll show you by doing that which goes against your presumptions of reason and rationality. Freedom takes precedence over rationality. Freedom takes precedence over ethics, it seems, in many cases for Dostoyevsky. And here's the transition into Camus, perhaps it will to an extent for Camus. This conception of freedom, are they taking it too far? To the exclusion of other elements of us. And I was going to go into Sartre's nausea, but that's not the next reading, and we're not going to actually cover that explicitly. I was making a joke there. It should be pretty easy to get into Sartre's nausea, because anyway. That play we'll talk about when we look at his chapter 2 from Being in Nothingness, because it will be helpful to look at some of these conceptions from the perspective of a playwright, which Sartre is. All right, so those central ideas of freedom, of hyper-consciousness, or at least, actually Dostoevsky pretty much said just any degree of consciousness, where that's what causes a recognition of contradiction. That's what causes a recognition of a problem, that there is a problem. Camus will push this line as well. Yes?
How did he die? 'Cause it looks like he's pretty young.
It looks like what?
He died at like 47,
46 years old, yeah.
46. How do you know?
Guess? Can you guess? Here he is. What's the motif? What's the motif? But he died of a car crash, that's right, yeah. But he was probably smoking in the car. Actually, he wasn't driving, his friend was driving. And he was probably smoking in the car. Yes, I think so. He died instantly. And somewhat strangely, it was found in his pocket a train ticket. He could have taken a train. He chose car. Well, yeah.
What's wrong with dying?
Any case, so there he is. He's famous literary figure, He got out. He's the youngest literary figure, in fact, to win the Nobel Prize. I don't have that here. Oh, there he is. I'll talk about that in a second. He started the journal Combat in response to... Huh? Cornbat? Oh, yes. It's not Cornbat. It's Combat. In response to is sort of the French resistance. He took on the French resistance. He battled the Nazis, and he wrote consistently about this. And in this way, he and Sartre became good friends. They diverged. We'll talk about how they differed. And I actually already did talk a little bit about how they diverged. And I like what Gaston Hall has to say. Not Gaston Hall, excuse me. Why they disagreed or where their disagreement was. In fact, I kind of touched on this already. Here's one of the differences. This is from a guy named Serge Dubrovsky. This is written about in a year after Camus' death. He says, oh, shoot. Quoting from the Stranger, Marceau, who's the main character, I don't know if you see his name in the reading, but Marceau is the main character of The Stranger. He's waiting for his inglorious death to be meted out to him, and then the supreme moment, what strikes him is its very unthinkability, this idea of his own death. I can visualize my corpse, says Marceau. It's not difficult, but I see it with my eyes. I should be able to think that I shall see or hear nothing anymore, that the world will continue for other people. We were not meant to do that kind of thinking. Excuse me, that was a quote from a play from Jean-Paul Sartre, where they're concentrating on thinking. That wasn't Marceau. The way that this was written was confusing. That was Sartre's conception, right? That I can visualize my corpse, but I can't understand this conception of not being able to think anymore upon the death of my body. That's a motif of The Stranger, of course. The Stranger is, well, estranged from others, from society, and in a way we'll see from nature to an extent too. We'll reference that next time, and maybe we'll get to a little bit with the Marxist concept of alienation. But here's Marceau. This is what I wanted to get to. I listened to my heart. I could not imagine that a noise which had been in me for so long could ever cease. I tried to visualize a certain instance when that heartbeat would no longer echo in my head, but it was in vain. End quote. Now here's the analysis from Dubrovsky. He says, death to the atheist seems to mean the same total and unthinkable annihilation, yet with a difference. And by the way, Sartre, clearly an atheist. Camus is more of a non-theist, kind of a pagan, which there's a difference between the two, which Dubrovsky doesn't clarify here. Characteristically enough for Sartre, what is annihilated is thought. And in his anguished query, centers on the continuation of the world after the disappearance of thought, while Camus' attention is focused on the stilling of the heart within the body, on the disappearance of life. Such a difference, slight as it may at first seem, contains the whole opposition between Sartre and Camus, even political in its germ. And I think that gets at it. And I agree. I agree with my dad, this is his book. He has a note in the comment on the side here to his friend Ivan, which is a schoolmate of his back in 1961. And it says, "This is brilliant." Just that's all it says. I think that's fascinating. I got into, I was interested in existentialist ideas because of my dad's bookshelves. So this is the first I saw of existentialism. Camus, The Stranger. And of course I thought it was Albert Camus. And I read it and I had no idea what was going on. But I think it's fascinating because I remember my dad telling me, and I just recently found this in his things. He passed away a number of years ago. And I looking through it, you see these little notes in here. It's fascinating. And I go back to the books that I read when I was younger, and there's notes all over it, some of which I can't read anymore, some of which is just stupid shit, I have to admit, but it is interesting to see that. And this, I think my dad is right. He reads that and he says at one point, shoot, I lost the page. It's got coffee all over it. I assume he was drinking coffee. Played chess with Ivan all the time at school. Where is it? He says at the end of this analysis from Dubrovsky, "This is so clearly correct. Why is this so hard for most people to discern this idea of the difference between Sartre and Camus? Because there was debates about whether or not they were friends or what they disagreed about. Yeah.
Do you think that after you die, your children will have a similar experience with your books that you leave behind?
Well, I thought about that. And in anticipation of that, I happened to have been reading this when my son was right next to me. And I wrote in the margin here, Milo just asked if reading this makes me sad because it was my dad's, and he wrote in it, and he died. And so I wrote that. I wrote that in the margin underneath the note that my dad wrote about This Is Brilliant. And then I put a date there too for when he sees that. I'll put my own coffee stains on it. And then my son will hopefully read this and he'll comment, and then Lola will get it and she'll have this be a dialogue.
You didn't answer the question.
What was the question?
No, it's your kid's question.
The question is
write it down.
Oh, no, I did answer it. I said no, it doesn't.
Oh, okay.
I should probably make that note in the notes
Well,
there.
I think you didn't even truly answer it because he won't really know until he has that same experience.
Yeah, he's 8, but he's, I don't want to say precocious because that really just means little shit. That's not right. Yeah, well, he's interested in philosophical ideas, I think, which is good. So let me try and wrap before we move on. He's not smoking there, but he had to step out, I'm certain. He had to step out after he won the Nobel Prize. He was the youngest Frenchman to win a Nobel Prize. Later on, Sartre will get one, but not accept it. I think I mentioned that before. He chooses not to accept the Nobel Prize because it's so just accepting the bourgeois system. Camus here said, yeah, I'll take it. Let me just get a smoke. There it is. So this is what I want to focus on for next time. You can see this preoccupation. And I think it waned in the 20th century, this preoccupation with death. It wanes. In the United States, I don't know about the rest of the world. We're not done yet. We still have about 4 more minutes. Does the class lose its meaningfulness knowing it only has 4 minutes left?
Nope.
If it would last forever, would it lose its meaningfulness? That's an anticipation. Shit! All right, so we have to stop. Thank you for reminding me. All right, so has everyone taken the test? Everyone took it, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll get it back to you. When you're done, please return it, look it over, put the Scantron on top of it. It's out of 100 points. I gave 2 points extra because that's what I typically do. Anyone who's close to 100, I'll give those whatever missing points there are, and then I give those to everyone. So you get an extra 2 points. The multiple choice questions, I have a couple of those here. Do not take those, but they're there to look and see which questions you might have gotten wrong.
How did you feel about the
Overall, pretty good. Better than my intro course does generally, and this is harder material, so I thought it was pretty good. All right, and then so look it over, but turn it in maybe over here with a space. Just put the Scantron on top of it. And if you have questions about my handwriting, let me know. Madeline? Paula? Brandon? Jacob? Lucian? Blake? Jacob? Chase? Isaiah? Isaac? Miley? Lexi? Oops. James? Missing a lot of people today. Robert? Jonathan? Blake? Dee? Sorry. Alicia?
Here.
Casey? Jordan? Bianca? Abdullah? I'm sorry. And
Something, I don't know.
sometimes unaware. Brock? Logan? Riley? Everardo? Antonia? Ben? Ella? And everyone should have gotten theirs back. Okay. And if you're done with them, oh yeah, so there's a couple of the, you may have to share, I didn't bring a bunch, sorry. A couple of those. If you didn't like how you did